sharing stories and talking to your friends about some things, you know, is a lot of fun, and it's a lot of entertaining, and some of the best laughs I've had in my professional career.
I think the name initially was thought to be a small fraternity of people that deal in aircraft, brokers, traders, peddlers. I don't think it was ever envisioned to be on the magnitude it is today.
When I think of ISTAT, it started essentially as a networking deal origination venue, and it evolved to a family.
Every individual in this organization has interests, talents, passions.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Michael Weiss, and I'm a board member of ISTAT, and I'll be hosting this first ISTAT chat. This is the first in a series of chats that is part of ISTAT's new online offering, which is made up of ISTAT chats and ISTAT learning labs. We're very excited about these offerings and hope that these initiatives will provide members with alternative platforms for networking and learning clearly in these difficult times. We've designed these chats to be different to other online offerings. We want these chats to showcase the quality, depth, knowledge, and experience of our membership. The format is going to be a bit of a fireside chat between two recognized leaders in the industry who know each other well, where the members can get a behind-the-scenes view of the individuals, what makes them tick, experiences, history in the industry, and insights, obviously, into the future. So now let me introduce the two gentlemen who will join me in this first chat. I'm delighted to be joined by Peter Barrett and Conor McCarthy. I'll just introduce the two guys. Peter Barrett is CEO of RBS Aviation Capital. He was appointed CEO of what was RBS Aviation Capital in 2004. During this time, he's managed the company's continued expansion to become one of the leading aircraft leasing companies in the world, with a fleet of 730 owned, managed, and committed aircraft. He oversaw the company's acquisition in 2012 by a consortium of Japanese institutions, including Sumitomo Mitsui Financial Group and Sumitomo Corporation. He's been involved in aircraft leasing and finance for 30 years, previously with RBS and initially with GPA. The other gentleman is Conor McCarthy, who joined aviation in 1978 as an apprentice avionics engineer. And he holds a BSc engineering degree from Trinity College in Dublin. 42 years experience, and he's worked with airlines around the world, including Ryanair and Qantas, and is a co-founder of the LCC's Jetstar, Viva Aerobus, and AirAsia. He's a founder and CEO of Plane Consult and Dublin Aerospace, with his entrepreneurship being recognized in Ireland and elsewhere. And I think he's also recently been appointed to the Irish government's task force on restarting aviation. I think the two gentlemen, but they'll tell you for themselves, have known each other for 20 years. I think Peter was at RBS Aviation Capital when they first met, and they've been firm friends since then. So just one more thing before we get into this is that if you, the audience, want to ask any questions to Peter or Conor, then please use the question and answer feature of the system and to send them in. I can't promise to ask all the questions, and so apologies if I don't get to yours. So with that, I think we should start. Gents, I thought I'd just start by asking you, how did you get into the business and why? Should we start with you, Peter, and then we'll come into with Conor?
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and thanks to everybody who's joined us. It's a great initiative by ISTAT, so well done to everybody in getting this going. You know, in these different times, it's great to be able to do this and use technology, so well done to all involved. Yeah, I'm not in the aviation industry quite as long as Conor. Now, Conor did start, I think, Conor, were you probably about 8 when you started, or 6 maybe, in 1978. But, you know, I started, so I originally did engineering, and I worked for a couple of years for what's now Accenture Consulting. And at the time in Ireland, there was a very famous company called GPA, Guinness Peak Aviation. Now, many of you will remember the company. Some of our younger members will probably not remember it. And really, it was the doyen of, frankly, of companies in Ireland. It was the place everybody wanted to work. And I didn't have any great passion for aviation per se. I mean, I suppose like all young people, I had an interest in travel and going around the world. But I wanted to work for a company that was successful and kind of recognized as being such in Ireland. So I saw an advert in the paper one day looking for, in the typical modest way of GPA, looking for, I think, rocket scientist or something to fly us to the future, with a very grandiose advertisement, I remember. Again, for those younger people in the audience, this is when you actually got jobs from newspapers. I applied for the job as an analyst, did lots of interviews, many interviews, with many of people I got to know very well, subsequently great characters. And I just ended up in GPA and what we used to call the trading floor, pricing deals and just being a general dog's body. So that's how I got into it.
Excellent. Conor, what about yourself? How did you get into it?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. It's very interesting. I guess from my point of view, I pretty much fell into the business through the apprenticeship scheme. Aer Lingus would have been one of the most auspicious employers on the north side of Dublin, where I was born and raised. And at the tender young age, not of 8, unfortunately, but of 16, I was very lucky to be selected as an apprentice aircraft electrician, as it was called back then. We now call it avionics engineer, but it was an aircraft electrician. It still is in many ways. And I started my aviation career there. And as at that time, there was a huge amount of night study went on. So while I was training to be an aircraft electrician, I took some exams at night and moved from being to qualifying as an electrical engineering technician. Then I did an engineering degree and then won a scholarship to go in and finish that degree in Trinity, all thanks to the far-sightedness, I guess, of Aer Lingus, which was an absolutely wonderful airline to work with, and spent 18 years with Aer Lingus, finishing up as chief executive of Aer Lingus Commuter before Michael O'Leary, a very little-known CEO of a small but growing airline called Ryanair, called me out of the blue and persuaded me to come over and join him to run operations, which I did. So I guess that was the start of my entree into what was low-cost carriers, which at the time represented the only airline format that made money in short haul. So having spent 5 years with Michael, then I decided to take that experience and package it and go out to the world and sell the low-cost model through Plane Consult, which I've run since then.
Good stuff. And what's kept you in the business, guys? I mean, kind of, what's kept you in this business? Has it been a love for the aviation industry? What, the challenge intellectually? What's kept you going in this business?
My analyst says that I'm a born masochist, and that's why I like to stay in the airline business. I think you're either hooked on kerosene or you're a masochist, but that's my excuse. I don't know what excuse Peter's going to give.
Yeah, I suppose like a lot of things in life, when you start doing something, it's hard to get out of it. Yeah, I mean, I suppose, and I worked for GPA for a number of years. In fact, it's probably worth just, I mean, you may not remember this, but certainly Mike, you'll remember it. One of my colleagues today was one of my colleagues in GPA, a colleague called Catherine Ennis, reminded me this morning that today is actually the anniversary of the failed IPO of GPA. So the 18th of June, 1992 is a day certainly that I remember very well. So I suppose it's kind of it's fitting that we're actually doing this chat on the same day, because I think a lot of lessons I learned and a lot of things that actually I love about aviation and the aircraft leasing business were from those days in GPA, both the good things and the bad things, and the good days and the bad days. But I suppose what keeps me in it, Mike, is I think it's just, aviation is such a great industry because it has so many different things, particularly the leasing part. I mean, because you've got finance, you have technical aspects, you've got legal aspects. It's truly global. I did a bit of a stint in different banks where I was always doing aviation, but was involved in other industries. And none of them are really as global or as far-reaching as aircraft. And that's really probably the thing that really hooked me, is the fact that you literally can be having a conversation with somebody in Sao Paulo in the evening, and the next morning it's Shanghai, and the next day it's Stockholm, and it's a global, truly global business. And also there's great people. I mean, both in the businesses I've worked in, fantastic role models on many things, maybe not such great role models on some other things in GPA. but really great people, interesting people, really smart people, and that's been the way all the way since then. I just worked with great people, including, I'm fortunate to work with a great team today. So that's really the thing that keeps me in it. Even industry that I've dabbled in and out of, it doesn't have that same take, that same energy, and that same engagement. I don't think I'm unique in that. I think that's what keeps people going, keeps people engaged in it.
Yeah, I agree with you, Peter.
Yeah.
I think, to be fair, I was being a bit churlish with my masochism comment, but you can never relax in this business. And as Peter said, there's some fantastic people, and you're constantly meeting new people who will challenge everything, and you're always challenged. There's no such thing as plain sailing in this business. So we're going through what people are describing now as the worst crisis ever to hit aviation. But frankly, I don't remember aviation going for more than 7 years without a crisis. As you mentioned at the outset, I joined aviation in 1978. We then had the oil crises. We had various wars. We had terrorism. We had hijackings. We had more wars. We had more economic crises. We had SARS. We had MERS. We had bird flu, swine flu. Now we've COVID. We've had the global financial crisis. I mean, there's just nothing that doesn't hit airlines and aviation because we're so connected around the world. When something happens in one part of the world, we generally do get hit almost immediately. And in a way, a lot of people listening to this might be in their early years in aviation, maybe hitting their first real crisis. What I would say is strap in, we'll get through this one. We do always, but we remake ourselves as we do it. And that's what challenges us. And I'd say, Peter, you might agree with me that, even at the tender young age of 58, I'm still learning new lessons every day. And I find that's really, I suppose it keeps you on your toes. It stops you becoming staid and going to seed. You just have to reinvent yourself all the time, as the airlines and companies have to do.
Absolutely, Conor. I mean, and it's funny. I mean, it's thinking about that day in 1992. I remember thinking at the time, the world has ended. What was a sure thing, what was a certain bet. We perceived it, or I perceived it as a young man at the time. Turned out it wasn't that. But you dusted yourself down, you picked yourself up, and if you look, I always think the story of GPA is perhaps its greatest success was its failure, because all the great businesses that came from GPA, all the people that came from it, all the great industry, much of it here in Dublin and in Shannon, it all came from that failure. And I think while the great point about the younger generation, this might be your first downturn, the things you learn during those downturns are really fantastic. And then, one of the things I was very fortunate and privileged after the collapse of the IPO, I got to be Patrick Blaney's bag carrier for a couple of years as he worked on the restructuring of GPA, and I learned so much in that. Well, probably more a year than a couple of years, and I learned so much in that much more than I actually had in the previous couple of years, and some very hard lessons, well thought, should I say, by Patrick. But that's really there. These are the days that you'll really learn, and I continue to learn. And in fact, I was saying we did a virtual offsite for our team. We were meant to have our annual offsite this past week, so we did a virtual one instead. And I was saying that I probably learned more in the last 3 months than I had in the previous 3 years, just because of you have to learn, because if you don't adapt and learn, then it's going to be very, very difficult. So you're absolutely right. So I mean, what I'd say to the younger people on this call is seize the opportunities. You're going to get great opportunities in the next couple of years, and you should grab them with both hands and run at them.
Agreed.
Yeah, I would agree as well. I must admit, just coming back to you, the collapse of GPA, I used to work for Swiss Bancorp at the time for a guy by the name of David Stacey, and with Dave Flooring Thomas, Steve Byrne, and a few others. And that day, when that collapsed, that IPO collapsed, it was we were all ashen, because I think the bank had something like $400 million out to GPA at the time on a bilateral basis. And it was, for us, again, a learning curve. The next I was a young guy in the business. I think I've been in the business for a year, and it was a learning curve as we got very intimately involved in the restructuring. I think that's when I first met you, Peter, going back all those years. But so, who have been your sort of your mentors individually in these businesses? You mentioned the likes of Patrick Blaney. I assume Tony Ryan must be in there somewhere. And Conor, you've mentioned Michael O'Leary. I mean, others people. I mean, who've been your mentors that have really sort of sparked your interest and kept you going?
Oh, apart from Conor, no, I think it's a lot of different people. I mean, a couple of people will come to mind in my some of the names you've mentioned. One person actually who comes to mind a lot when I think about GPA is a guy called Mike Dolan, which some of you may remember. He's passed away now, probably 10 years or more, and a really interesting character, a very shall we say, colourful character in many ways, but a really, he always saw the other side of the trade. He always saw the other side of the opportunity, and he was exceptionally creative, much more creative than I am. But he always, I think he taught me that, you got to try and see the other side of the coin, the other side of what the trade might be, which was a great thing for me. And I think over the years, you try to pick up different things from different people. I mean, one of the things I've tried to learn in the last number of years, and I see it particularly among some of my colleagues in the office, good communication skills and good, perhaps when you're 25 or 20 or 30, you're thinking it's all about the trade, about the numbers, about the, the deal. And actually there's so much more to it than that. And I think some of the things I've learned, for example, I worked for a few years for a bank called Credit Bank, which a great guy there. Again, he's unfortunately passed away as well, a guy called Liam Donlan, who was a great deal guy, but he had a superb way about him and was a great communicator and just a great people person. And I think I've probably learned, perhaps too late in life, that that's such a great skill. It's such an important skill. Conor, I'm not just buttering Conor up here, but Conor's got a lot of those skills, and I think to do what Conor does out in Dublin Airport, and perhaps you can talk about this, Conor. It's a much different business having a maintenance shop than having an aircraft leasing company or an airline, and so having those communication skills is really, really important.
Wow, kind of have me blushing now, Peter. Normally we bounce off each other by slagging each other, so I'm not able to take compliments easily from Peter. But I appreciate it. Thank you. I guess just on the mentoring side, one person stands out. Well, two, I guess, that I met in my time in Aer Lingus, and they were contemporaries of mine, would be Alan Joyce, who now runs Qantas Group, and Willie Walsh, who runs IAG, and which stables the likes of BA and Iberia and Welling and Aer Lingus, of course. They're two guys who are very, very different. And we almost grew up together in Aer Lingus. I remember when I was appointed to CEO of Aer Lingus Commuter, in a very short space of time, Willie was promoted to CEO of Futura Airlines in Spain, which was a great little charter operator that was owned by Aer Lingus. And then Alan is just a superb all-rounder. And Peter mentioned the importance of being a people person. Like, Alan has such phenomenal respect for his fellow workers, and he has put through some of the toughest industrial relations agendas in Australia, which is one of the toughest countries to work in. I can vouch for that, having been there. The number of hurdles you have to go through on the industrial relations front is quite phenomenal. And he does it by having an absolutely undying respect for the people who do the work, but recognizes that as a manager, his duty to them is to provide them with a secure place to work, which has a future. And because of that, he's absolutely no problem marrying a very tough industrial relations agenda with his love of the people who works for the business he's in. So they're two great guys. It would be, wrong of me not to say that Michael O'Leary as a CEO is one of the most impressive people I've ever worked with. He's an absolutely razor sharp strategist. He absolutely has no desire whatsoever to impress people. He knows what he knows, and he keeps it to himself unless he needs to let other people know it. But he is so sure-footed. He's an amazing business leader. Absolutely with that comes the trappings of a great, almost military ruler. Like he knows exactly where he's going next. He has a battle plan. He is happy to go to battle, and you're fighting with him or you're fighting against him. But he's an impressive character, and I worked with Michael for almost 5 years in Ryanair, and even since I left there 20 years ago, I'm still remembering lessons that I learned at the time. So again, a great privilege to work with those people. And I suppose on the aircraft front, I've been lucky enough over the years to work with a lot of airlines and do a lot of different deals on aircraft and fleet and so on. Some very impressive people in that area. I suppose who come to mind would be Chris Buckley, who's recently left Airbus, fantastic person, and Kieran Rao, another brilliant strategist. They're two great guys to have worked with. I've gone through a lot of tough times in the airline business with them, and I find that they're really kind of switched on, fantastic customer-oriented people who know their own business very well. As Peter said earlier, we've got some amazing talent in the business. We've attracted a huge amount of talented people with, as we say, brains to burn. But it's the people who meld that with their personal skills and their strategic, management that really come through. But you could go on for hours about people who you learn off. As Peter said, there's so many great people. Some unfortunately still not with us. But they're inspirational, and it's great that you can meet them every day. I think that's one of the things I miss about the COVID with the COVID crisis is not being able to interact as much. It's intercontinental travel is tough. It's hard on the body. It's difficult when you're trying to do a 4-day turnaround in the Far East or something. But it's the people you meet that give you the energy to get going on day 2 and day 3. And I miss that interaction, I have to say. And Zoom doesn't do it for me. It's fine on occasion, but I think we've got ourselves a business when this is all over, because people need to be in touch with other people.
I completely agree with you, Conor, because it's funny. We've had a couple of things in the last couple of months we needed to get done, and I don't think they would have got done unless I had the relationship. I had broken bread and had a few beers and spent time with people over the last 20 years. So you can have that Zoom call and you can have the telephone call, but it works because you know them, and I think that connectivity is really important. I mean, I think when I'm sure there'll be questions later on about the future and what happens, but I think that because when I think back on my career to date, it's those relationships, it's the times you spend with people. It's actually not the deals you remember generally. The deals are part of it and they're the context, but it's actually the people and the circumstances and very often the funny stories and the perhaps the unrepeatable stories that you need to. They're the things that you actually remember, and they're the things that that make it worth that make it a bit of fun and make it enjoyable. I mean, it's obviously great to do the deals and all that kind of stuff, but it's the people part of it that is really, really important. And as I said, I think that's probably something I've learned more as I've got older, and learned the importance of that part of it. And it's been very evident to me in this new normal, or what do you want to call it today. It's definitely very evident to me.
Yeah, agreed.
So we're obviously going through some difficult times at the moment, but just as you mentioned earlier, Conor, that there's this industry is cyclical. We have been through a number of different issues through the industry. How do you? Can you just talk about both of you actually managing in difficult periods and difficult times? I mean, RBS into SMBC and SMFG for SBC Aviation Capital. What are the biggest management challenges that you guys faced in trying to keep people together and moving things forward?
That's a great question, Mike. And if Conor, you happen for me to have a go at that, and then I'll hand over to you. But I think, and I certainly learned a huge amount 12 years ago when RBS got into difficulty, and I hope that I've taken some of those lessons to today. And I'd say that the most important thing in terms of leading people is communication, and to be open and consistent and as honest as you possibly can be, and direct, and regular, candid communication, I think has gone a long way, and that's certainly something I think, I've tried to take from the last crisis and try and apply that today. So that communication and candidness is really important. I also think purpose is really important. I think people need to know why they're doing what they're doing, what the objective is, and that can be small things. It can be, we need to manage this receivable, or it could be big things around their strategy and around their portfolio. So it's trying to give people that sense of purpose and a sense of where we're going to. And that's certainly, I've tried to do that. Hopefully I get it wrong. I hopefully I get it right more than I get it wrong. But I think it's always something you can improve. But they're probably the two things I would say in trying to lead through a crisis is communication and clarity of purpose. I don't know, Conor, what's your view? I mean, you've done lots of this over the years.
Yeah, I seem to specialize in crisis management. When I'm trying to avoid crises, I seem to run into a bigger one. But
there's a message there somewhere, Conor.
What's that?
There's a message there somewhere.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, stay away from me if you want to avoid a crisis. But I think what Peter said about communications, absolutely fundamental. Crisis management is about people management, and people management is about communicating. And so the great thing about a crisis is that you have a singular, irrefutable fact that you're facing. And it's usually existential, as is COVID-19. I mean, without sounding too big of a worry out there, the toughest days are ahead of us in the airline business. So we've, got fleets grounded. We have full focus on cash management, trying to make sure that when we come out of this thing, we have enough blood left in the veins that we can actually, reconstruct our airline networks and get people back flying. So the tough times are ahead as we try to get aircraft back in the air. The advantage, if you could call it that, is it's irrefutable. You really can't be in denial about how important and how critical this crisis is. So it's possible very quickly to communicate to everybody in your organization, and I guess all your stakeholders as well, as to, look, we have a real challenge here. This is what we now need to do. And you get out there. Having said that, I look around and I see some airlines that are having a real problem with their social partners and trying to persuade them of the depth of the journey they have to go on in order to come back out of this thing alive. One only has to look at the refusal of the unions in British Airways to engage in discussions or in meaningful discussions to realize that not everybody thinks this is going to be a crisis that they have to be part of the solution in. And that's not just British Airways. I mean, we see some problems locally here with some of the Aer Lingus unions where they've, actually there's a bit of an internecine warfare going on. So from my point of view, the communications message is critical. And as Peter said, that everybody then realizes that we have a goal and I have a purpose. So it reminds me of when the space program was underway. And I think it was President Kennedy went to see the early development in the site. And it was obviously long before the program got really going well. Or it could have been Kennedy's successor. Probably was, now that you mention it. And he met a man who was sweeping the floor in the space center, and stopped to talk to him and said, "So what do you do around here?" And he said, "What do I do? I'm going to put a man on the moon." And, that singular purpose is probably one of the high points of recent US history. That whole program of putting a man on the moon when they hadn't even developed the first, auto flight computer, that they hadn't even developed memory. They hadn't developed the space capsule that could keep somebody alive in space. They hadn't even got engines within 1/7 of the power that they needed to get the Saturn rocket off the ground. And yet they managed with that level of vision to pull all of those wonderful innovations together that I think America capitalized on for the following 25 years. Communications is fantastic messaging. It's about clarity, it's about simplicity, and it's about feedback. And it's about not necessarily, giving out rewards at the end of it all. It's just about saying thanks and well done, because I think you did a great job there, which is the most important motivator for most people.
Yeah, absolutely true. I mean, your point there, Conor, is really interesting. It strikes me about the fact of people coming to terms with the challenges we face, and that kind of sense that the penny may not have dropped yet. And just to go back briefly to that, I mean, I do always remember about the back to the IPO story, the GPA IPO story, is that it took 6 months before everybody realized what the problem was and how big the problem was for GPA, and it took another 6 months before you actually really dealt with it. And I actually think that that's probably something that we're still in the early days of the challenges that we face, and I think it's going to take time. Time is good in a number of senses, but first of all, I think if time passes, we'll have more clarity as to what the challenges we face. And to your point, we'll find the solutions. I mean, we will find solutions. There won't be solutions for everybody and every situation, but we will find solutions. But it's going to take time, and we're still at the early stages of this game, in my view.
I agree. I mean, who would have predicted 6 months ago that European governments would be handing out the guts of 40 billion euros to their national flag carriers, a term I thought had long since been buried, in order to keep them alive at the expense of other airlines. It's quite amazing, really, how quickly those governments move to protect national icons in what's supposed to be a single market. I'd have my views on it, as you could probably guess, but I certainly feel it's grossly unfair that an airline that is stronger is now in a weaker position because of a national bailout. And it seems to have happened literally on the turn of a sixpence, really.
Yeah, no, it's going to be. I think it's going to be challenging. Although, I mean, to take, and I understand your views on that, Conor. I think to take a more, I suppose, one perspective though on that is that what struck me about, and it's governments all over the world, it's right across the world, that there's been the importance of aviation. I mean, there's a clear recognition that air travel is going to, whatever this recovery is going to look like, whenever it starts properly, we're going to need airplanes moving people around the world. That is clear. And I think that's one of the reasons the governments throughout the world have behaved the way they have. But I do recognise the challenges, and it does create a fairly challenging playing field for the non-flag carrier, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah, I agree. And I do see the recognition amongst the regulators of how critical aviation is to their national economic engines. I think the challenge is some weaker countries and weaker economies simply can't afford the level of rescue that some of the wealthier economies can put out there. And I include the US here, by the way. The CARES Act is a fairly generous act. It's dished out immediate cash to a huge number of airlines. Every airline in the States, basically, in proportion to its capacity. So it's the US have been quick on this mark as well, even though it's a generally free market economy. They have given it out on a proportionate basis, which is a fair means of doing it. Whereas you see in countries like France and Germany and Austria and Italy, like they've given no money to some players who contribute a huge amount of the national capacity, and they've given lots of money to others who just happen to have their shareholders living in Germany or maybe their headquarters based there. I do see it as a step back, mainly because we've spent a long time weaning weaker airlines off the government tit, as we'd say, and now everybody's been given a carte blanche to get back on there, and that's a taxpayer issue, and taxpayers won't like that. They'll be upset about it, and then they'll make demands which may see airlines going backwards in relation to even their efficiencies and their pricing. And as industry players, I guess we should be concerned about that, because it might lead to restrictions.
Yeah. Well, I think there's all of these macroeconomic interventions are going to have consequences in the long term, and it's going to be, I think it's hard to know what they'll be. But I suppose from the airline perspective, Conor, and you've been involved in the boards of lots of different types of airlines. You've got lots of them as your customers. How do you think it might look like in a year or 2 years' time in terms of, I don't mean necessarily the market demand, but what do you think the market might look like given those things you talked about the kind of the support given and some of the distortions you're concerned about?
I think we will see the big players survive. I think they will be smaller. There are trade-offs. For instance, the French government have insisted that Air France stop flying certain routes and hand them over to the surface operators. They've used the opportunity to advance a green agenda, which is hard to argue with. If you can, take a train TGV from A to B, and you only spend an extra, 30-40% of time on the train versus the aircraft journey, and your carbon footprint is like 20% of that or 10% of that. It's a real factor, and we've seen it in recent elections, not just here in Ireland but across the world, how important the environment is, and how the younger generation have really woken up to this fact and are willing, unlike our generation, they're willing to make real hardship trades in the environment. And so, it behoves us to go with that, desire and try and fix it. I think we'll see probably 4 low-cost carriers emerge in Europe, independent ones I'm talking about. And there'll be a major shakeout of the tertiary airlines, I guess, the small people, the small airlines, and some of the small holiday operators who went into this weak. If you went into this crisis anyway weak, I think your chances of coming out the other end are very slim. And as finance becomes scarcer and if access to finance becomes more, difficult, I think you'll find that the people providing finance in the industry are the ones who will almost be calling the shots as to who survives and who doesn't. I suspect the same is going to be true for the leasing community, Peter. There's lessors very heavily leveraged that are going to have to roll over debt, and that's going to
I think it's really interesting, and I think I would agree with you in terms of the going into this strong, or the position you went into this in terms of perhaps your financial strength, or indeed your strategy or market position, will probably have a significant outcome input in how you come out of it. But on the leasing side, I think it's there's been a lot of leasing companies that got into the business in this cycle, and I think some of them, particularly I think some of their owners, are going to say, why are we in this? A capital intensive, relatively high risk business. We need to think about what we're doing in it. So I think you're going to see some shakeout there as well. I agree with that.
Yeah.
So you see consolidation, do you, Peter, on the amongst the lessors? It's a question actually coming in from Laurie Fabian. Do you anticipate consolidation in the leasing company industry, including layoffs? Do you think that that's a fair thing that's going to happen?
I think that the layoff question is going to depend on the individual companies. I think I think consolidation is certainly, it's always, and I suppose people tend to talk about consolidation, and it's always been around, Mike, in my experience. It's been there since GCAS or GE took over GPA, and you had all the different twists and turns of what was Airfi became AirCap, and all those things. So it's part of our industry. I do think that the types of stresses and strains we see at the moment on the industry and on the markets generally, the financial markets, are going to likely to drive consolidation. Now, the exact timing and format of that, I think, remains to be seen. Generally, as I've said, if you look at what happened back in the early 90s, it takes time for these things to wash through the system, and things like refinancing cliffs and stuff like that to start focusing minds. But I do think it's likely to happen. So yeah, I think there will be an element of consolidation, inevitably, and that's probably not a bad thing, frankly, because it's a very crowded marketplace with a lot of leasing companies, and in a industry where margins have been getting more competitive. Consolidation is a kind of a natural development. You've seen that in lots of other industries. You saw it in the airline industry, to varying degrees in varying markets. So I think you're likely to see it in our industry as well.
I'd just like to take one point there. I understand that the leasing market has got more crowded and more competitive, but At the same time, we would have to admit that the margins earned in the leasing business are just an absolute multiple of other players in the food chain. So obviously, I know the MRO business intimately. That's a pretty weak margin business, but it's a little bit like the white squares on the Monopoly board. People have to stop for water and electricity, and you earn a little bit of money, and it's more consistent even in a downturn. So you get a little bit of an upside kick there. But the airlines have only latterly begun to earn anything like appropriate margins and, more importantly, appropriate returns on capital. And even at that, there's, unfortunately, too few of them worldwide doing it, because, you still have some ruinous competition and behavior amongst airlines. But overall, they've begun to improve. And on top of that, then, a key factor coming into this crisis is our banking industry, our finance industry, and our stock markets have been doing quite well. And the big surprise for all of us is, despite an almost 30% drop in the markets at the start of this crisis, a lot of the markets have made back most of their losses at this stage, which is really strange. Of course, the S&P 100 is not the same as it was coming into the crisis, and the likes of Zoom Communications, for example, is now worth more than, I think, the top 20 airlines in the world. And nobody, well, I certainly hadn't heard of Zoom before. I was doing chats on WhatsApp and Skype, but not Zoom. Now I'm a Zoomer, but it's quite amazing how quick the world has become, and how these just giant companies come out of nowhere now. So one thing I'll be very interested in as we emerge from this crisis are two things. One is travel patterns. How soon will we see the different market segments return? And I think there's a general consensus that the business market may be one of the last ones to return, particularly a high volume business market, i.e. conferences and so on. And of course, the second thing then is finance. We've gone into this crisis, and governments, which we might have all been a little bit cynical of in our old age, we've seen them respond really quickly to give support, even through furlough payments and keeping people on the book, etc. So the governments have moved with uncharacteristic speed in this, and has stopped an absolute meltdown of economies. And as we emerge from the crisis, the question will be, what will the financial markets do? And in that, the behavior of the banks and at all levels of society will, to a great extent, dictate how well we come out of this crisis and how quickly we come out of it. So I think that's an unknown, frankly. I'd be reluctant to guess which way they go.
Although I would argue, it's a great point, Conor. I mean, I would argue that we kind of do know that, because I think, the central banks around the world have opened the spigot. They've actually taken the spigot off. They're just, the hose pipe is full on.
What's big?
So I think they've, so I would review, and I think, and I think you're right. I think that the governments have responded quickly and positively to minimize the damage done, but there is going to be damage done. So I think it'll be more, and I think this is probably the point for the aviation industry generally, is that the dollar, though, is going to be, the dollar can go anywhere. It doesn't have to come to our industry, and we're going to have to ensure that we're showing the types of recovery and the types of management of the risks we have to get the dollar to come to us, because it's going to be more expensive. I mean, while there's a lot of money around, and the cost of money is broadly cheaper, it's going to be more expensive for our industry generally, and for some more than others, based on their strategy and their performance. So I think it's going to be a real challenge. I mean, I'm really, your previous point about behaviors is really interesting, and again, certainly our perspective, and you may have viewed from the different boards you sit on the different airlines you advise. Our perspective is that leisure is likely to recover quickly, and people are going to fly. They're going to fly relatively close to where they live. So if you're in Chicago, you want to go to Florida, get a bit of sun. If you're in Manchester, you want your 2 weeks on the Spanish coast, whatever it happens to be. That flying will probably recover relatively quickly. But I think, the longer haul stuff, the discretionary business trip to New York or to Sydney or whatever it might be, that's going to be harder to recover and harder to get back. Particularly because I think a lot of people are doing things like this. They're doing business, remotely, and broadly, it's worked reasonably well. So what are your fellow board members? What are your airline customers saying about their view of the recovery, Conor?
I think you're broadly in line with them. Your view there is that leisure travel and leisure airlines are likely to recover earlier, and short haul travel will happen next, particularly domestic markets, as we know, China, the US, even intra-European, if we can get that working right. And then it'll spread to some shorter international travel, followed by some intercontinental travel. Now, if I'm sitting in the boardroom in Emirates, I have a different view of life. I have no choice. I have to get intercontinental moving again. So what those airlines do will be interesting. I was surprised to see Qantas today mention that they don't plan to have international flights for quite a while now. I think they're talking about December of this year, which is a long time to leave international travel and that market sitting alone. But they've obviously taken a view on that particular one. So what would we see? I think we see those airlines really, their best, most optimistic plans are to get back to 2019 levels of capacity by 2021. So almost taking a view that 2020 is a write-off. If we can get our capacity back in the air, we'll do it for 2021. From a fleet point of view, we've a lot of airlines that are looking at aircraft rollover and saying, you know what, let's return these aircraft. We had an extension option, we won't extend, and we think that the aircraft will be cheaper in the future, so let's take that risk. And so, for example, in Dublin Aerospace, we find ourselves busy this summer doing aircraft lease returns that we'd never see them ahead of the winter, simply because airlines would normally use those aircraft this time of the year. So you've got some thinking like that where they're rolling out aircraft because they can, in the hope that they can pick up capacity when there is an upturn. And it's hard to argue with that position because it's a conservative view and nobody gets rewarded for being too brave at a time like this. But I do agree with you. I think we're going to see the aircraft, the short-haul aircraft in the air first. Some fallout among the weaker short-haul airlines. And also probably an increased interest in smaller aircraft, whereas the last 5 to 10 years we've seen a growing interest in the larger narrow bodies like the A321 versus the A319. I think we might see a swing back towards that smaller aircraft where there's less trip costs and where the airline can maximize its yield. So we might see fares go up as well where that's possible.
Yeah, I think you're on the money there, Conor. Mike, I'm conscious that you get two paddies together, all we do is talk, and we're not given the an opportunity. I don't want the people to feel that they're.
No, you guys are doing great. I was going to interject with just a quick question on aircraft values. When you talk about airlines getting aircraft back up into the sky, are they looking more at the newer aircraft? What does it mean for the older aircraft? There's various questions that have come through. Do we see that aircraft values are going to take a bit of a hit? I think Ishka put out something yesterday or the day before, which is talking about sort of values going down about 16% on narrow bodies, not to mention the wide bodies and the 330s, which was a much higher percentage. What's your views generally? And I would also say, Conor, on the parts market, you've got all these older aircraft, some of which won't come back into the sky. Do you think there's the parts market's going to get flooded basically with excess supply and not much demand in the short term?
I'll take it first, and Peter then, as the true expert in aircraft values, can tell us what the real story is. But first of all, on the aircraft, what's interesting at the moment is that fuel is so cheap that the business case for a modern aircraft with its fuel efficiency doesn't work. And of course, with so many aircraft around, you almost have your pick of the crop. Having said that, fuel is cheap right now because fuel isn't being burned right now, and jet fuel and the jet fuel refineries are doing nothing. So I think the current hiatus in fuel prices is purely that. It's because demand has been chopped so much. But when demand returns, I think we might see fuel prices climb back up towards levels where the more fuel efficient aircraft become attractive again. So I think that's one plus. The second thing is obviously Boeing with the MAX. I see Boeing getting the MAX recertified this summer. They've done a lot of work behind the scenes. They've taken the aircraft off the front end. They've done their work. They've worked with the FAA, and I can see them being in a position to start delivering that type in the fall, as they say in the United States. And that's obviously going to bring lots of complications because there's a lot of orders out there, and there's aircraft that are earmarked for retirement. But I do see it having its place. It's a very fuel efficient aircraft. It competes with the Neo, and that will become a popular choice in the future. So to some extent, the crisis, in Boeing has helped the airline industry with the current crisis, because we could be in a worse position had all those MAXs delivered. Having said all of that, I agree with you. The used materials market is one that was getting very frothy. Aircraft engines were selling at quite high prices relative to the list price of the parts, and I believe that the levels of inventory now will just go sky high. And also airlines that are shrinking to a portion of their previous size will defer a lot of engine maintenance in order to preserve cash. And that's further green time being used. And that's more engine shop visits being avoided. So for some time, we're going to see the knock-on effects of this as the market gets back to normal. But it is a time-based problem. In time, I believe demand will fill the seats that are there, and they will increase demand for new seats. And with that demand will come, more buoyancy in the balance sheets, and with the balance sheets will come more fleet work and more fleet additions. I would not like to be in the wide-body twin marketplace at the moment. It's a very crowded place. It's difficult to see when they're going to get back to a degree of normality in terms of flying. And I think the long-haul airlines that have efficient networks will have a very nice choice of low-cost capacity for a while yet.
Yeah, I mean,
okay, Peter, what's your?
Yeah, I think the fuel question is an interesting one. I mean, we've been of the view, and I'm of the view for some time, is that the best hedge for airlines on oil is to actually buy more fuel efficient airplanes. And I think it's really interesting. You see some people have been caught short on hedges, and I think Conor is right that the fuel price will as demand increases will go up, and I think that will drive people towards more efficient aircraft. And also I think, frankly, that it's going to be a tough market for all airlines to make a buck, and every dollar is going to count. So if you can squeeze a couple of percent here and a couple of percent there, and that'll include on obviously capital cost of the aircraft, but also operating costs, be that maintenance cost or fuel cost, you're going to take it. So as the market recovers, I mean, I think newer aircraft, younger, more fuel efficient aircraft are the ones that are going to start flying first. And I think going to the value question, they're the ones that value is going to recover on first. I mean, clearly, and different valuers have different appraisers, different opinions on value. Clearly, values have been impacted. Really, the question is what's the recovery in those values going to look like, and what's going to recover when? And if you look at previous recessions, younger airplanes they recover more quickly, and I think we're going to see a similar. This is a deeper trough, obviously, but I think we're going to see a similar recovery we saw after the financial crisis and after 9/11, you'll see, it's probably going to take us 2 or 3 years for aircraft values to turn around, and it's going to be, in our view, younger narrow-body aircraft will get there sooner. The other interesting thing, I think that the MAX point is very well made by Conor, but also this the generally post-crisis, the manufacturers recognise pretty quickly there's not a lot of point in building airplanes that people aren't going to be able to either fly or buy. And I think you're seeing that already with the behaviour of Boeing and Airbus, and I think we're going to have to see more of that as this downturn plays out. So the market will get back to an equilibrium, and when that happens, and demand starts to recover, I think you'll see aircraft values beginning to recover as well. But it's not going to be for every aircraft type. Older, bigger airplanes are going to be more challenged, in our view.
Yeah,
fair enough.
Look,
we've got a couple of minutes left.
Sorry,
just
a very quick point. 2 points actually. I think this crisis might have heralded the death of the quad. It's very hard to see the 4-engined aircraft making it back into the sky after this one. Now, I'll be proved wrong by 1 or 2 niche carriers that'll make a great success of it, just like ValueJet did with the DC-9-30 back in the 80s. But I do believe we're going to see the death of the quad, which is a shame in a way. We all love flying on them, but it's just in terms of efficiency, airlines will just really lean on minimizing their aircraft types in the fleet, and they will focus on the most fuel efficient vehicles and the most maintenance efficient vehicles. The other thing worth saying is, as the old saying goes, never waste a good crisis. Look around and look at the airlines that are restructuring in this crisis. There's a lot of restructuring going on. A lot of airlines who had, over the last number of years, had allowed their cost base to rise and had been, very, very accommodating with demands from unions in relation to pay and lifestyle changes. You'll find that the more efficient, well-managed airlines have not been sitting on their hands for the last 12 weeks, and they have been progressing significant agendas to give them some competitive advantage coming out of this. And I think that's going to be an interesting factor and be one to watch. And it'll play against the airlines that have leaned on government support, because those airlines will have given up a certain amount of leverage in relation to their, let's say, their social partners. And therefore they will have failed to make the changes that would have made them efficient. And that in itself might create an even bigger gap between themselves and the independent airlines, let's say, when this is all over. So that'll be another interesting dynamic to watch for.
Absolutely. Look, gentlemen, I think an hour is never enough. We could carry on chatting, I'm sure, for hours on this, on the various subjects. I just want to thank you very much, both Peter and Conor. Thank you very much for attending this and being so much part of this inaugural ISTAT chat. And thank you very much. Round of applause virtually or whatever. I just wanted to mention very quickly that thanks to all the ISTAT team, the HQ guys, the tech guys who put this together in short frame, it's been very high quality production, in my opinion, and it's taken a lot of time and effort to get here. So I just wanted to thank you very much to them. Just 2 other quick points. The first ISTAT Learning Lab will be with Dick Forsberg on the 30th of June at 10 a.m. US Central Time, and he'll be talking about the post-COVID airline landscape. I wonder if he'll pick up on some of the points that you guys have raised this afternoon. And then the next ISTAT chat will be between Pete Seidlitz, president of Bristol, and Jerry Lederman, CFO of United Airlines, which will be on the 1st of July at 10:30 New York time, 15:30 Dublin time, and 22:30 Singapore time. So that will be on the 1st of July. Other events are on the ISTAT website, istat.org.